Hey guys, and welcome to episode 88 of the OCDstories.com podcast. Now in this episode, I interviewed Jon Hershfield. Jon is a therapist, and some of you may remember if you've been following this podcast for a while, that I had him on in episode 6 to talk about OCD recovery, his OCD story, and many other wonderful things. It still remains one of your favourite episodes, which is the feedback I get from a lot of you. And if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you to do. Jon shared some great advice on that episode. But sort of 82 episodes on now, I wanted to discuss his book, When a Family Member Has OCD. Now, this has been out for a year or two now, I think this book has, or just over a year. But I wanted to get him on to talk about his advice for family members. Family members are those with OCD, because I don't feel that it gets talked about enough. We always talk about OCD recovery, the people suffering, but it's not just a single person. We all impact others, whether we want to or not, unfortunately. And I wanted to discuss this book to shed some light on what a family member goes through, but also, give them some more advice and support to comfort themselves, to cope with it better, because it can be very stressful seeing your loved one hurting. And also, more importantly, I guess, find tools and tactics for them that they can implement so that they can support you if you have OCD or their loved ones with OCD better, and not enable them if that's maybe what they do, when to get involved in compulsions and when to not, etc. And we discuss many things, including why we shouldn't feel shame as a family when seeking treatment for OCD. The golden rule of supporting a family member with OCD is quite simply to remain a family member, and Jon explains why that is the golden rule. It's really interesting. Jon talks about 3 things a family needs to know about their loved one with OCD, and I think this could be really eye-opening if you're a family member. He talks about the 4 I's which a family member can use to interact with their loved one with OCD and help them kind of recover or cope in the moment, which is identify, invite, interrupt, and integrate. And he talks about how these help. He talks about mindfulness as a family, how a family member, it's natural to get frustrated sometimes with your loved one with OCD, and that's okay, and how to kind of react to that. And also, Jon talks about sort of psychoeducation, so the free books that will help you understand OCD more. This is just a very heartfelt and genuine conversation, I felt, with loads of advice for the family members. And even if you're listening now and you have OCD or not a family member, we still talk about many things generally to do with OCD recovery, so you'll get a lot out of it. But my plea to you is really, if your family are involved in your OCD recovery or you want them to be more involved, please do share this with them, because they're most likely not listening to this podcast. Share it with them, and it may offer them some advice and tips to help them and help them help you get better quicker. This, OCD recovery is a family effort. As Chris Bear from the Unstuck documentary said to me when I interviewed him, a family that fights OCD together beats OCD together. And I really like that slogan. And do check out Jon's book, When a Family Member Has OCD, which is what this interview is based off. So without further ado, here is Jon, and enjoy. On the podcast today, I have Jon Hershfield. Jon is a psychotherapist based in Maryland who specialises in the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder. He is the author of 3 books, the Mindfulness workbook for OCD and When a Family Member Has OCD, and the soon-to-be-released Everyday Mindfulness for OCD, which he co-wrote with Charlotte Nicely. Welcome back to the show, Jon.
Thanks for having me.
Cool. So I just about got through that introduction. So we're going to get you on again at some point with Charlotte to talk about your new book. But on this episode, I wanted to cover this book I'm holding, if anyone watching on YouTube, When a Family Member has OCD, because it's not a topic I've really covered. The idea of this podcast is to give advice and tips for the family members on how to best support their loved one with OCD and also look after themselves, equally as important. So in the start of your book, in sort of the thanks section, you put to my parents who never called me crazy. And I like that. And I wanted to get from your personal history, how were your parents supportive?
Yeah, well, they called me other names, but No, I'm kidding. Um, I grew up in a household where discussion of mental illness was not, there wasn't anything taboo about it. There wasn't anything particularly mystical about it. My father's a psychiatrist, and he's always had as long as I can remember, he's had a practice at the home. And so growing up, I would just see people come up the driveway, strangers. We lived in rural Maryland on a farm. And so, I'd see people come up the driveway, and they were just customers basically. And they'd go into his office and come out, and I didn't have any contact with them or anything, but I knew that they were there to see him, and I knew that he was a psychiatrist, and I knew that had something to do with mental health. And, and back then, the pharmaceutical companies, they would give you, they would give the psychiatrists, notepads and, pens and stuff like that. So always around the house, there'd be like, office supplies with the word Prozac on it and things like that. So I just grew up around mental health being a sort of normal thing, and no different from medical health. And as anybody who's watching this, podcast knows, OCD is a familial disorder. It's somewhat genetic, it's somewhat learned, but we know it runs in families. And myself having OCD and various members of my family system having their own struggles with different types of issues. When I discovered sometime in my teens that I needed professional help, this wasn't looked at as some sort of scandal. This was looked at more like, okay, like I also happen to not have great knees, and at some point I need to get that addressed too. So.
Okay, a good point. My next question was actually referencing your dad's practice and how you said it was normal. You just saw them coming up the drive. And I guess, so it's normal for you, but I guess for some families there may still be a lot of stigma. Hopefully less so now, the amount the media is covering various mental difficulties. But for those family members who still, I guess, stigmatise mental illness, or maybe are scared to tell the wider family about their son or their wife, whatever it is, I guess what would you say to them if they came to you and said that they still had this stigma? How would you kind of address that?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from anxiety within the whole family system. So usually when you hear parents who are resistant to their child, let's say, having some kind of mental health diagnosis, it's not always because they have some ridiculous ideas about mental health, although there's there's definitely a problem of lack of education and people just not understanding that these are treatable disorders and that there's nothing to be ashamed of. But I think a lot of parents who are resistant to it are afraid that it's their fault, and they're afraid of feeling shame and judgment from their community. What did you do to damage your child or something like that? Or if it's a partner, what your husband wouldn't have this problem if you were a better wife, and that sort of stuff gets in your head. And unfortunately, in some cases, influence your decision to see what's going on clearly enough to get people the help that they need. And sometimes it can result in, resentments. Why do you have to have this problem? You're ruining my life because you have this problem. Can you just stop having this problem? Yeah. So communication, goes without saying. Communication is key. Being able to speak openly and honestly about what's going on, being open to new information. Because any parent who reads enough about OCD or comes in for a session or two to meet with their child's OCD therapist is going to know very quickly that this is not their fault. It might be their responsibility to help their child or to help their partner in some way or another. But once relieved of the fear of blame and guilt, they can actually be more supportive.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. I had a question later on, actually, which was about, is it my fault that my family member has OCD? And you've just addressed that, which is good. Okay, so you've put the gold in your book. You say, so I'm paraphrasing, the golden rule for supporting a family member with OCD is to remain a family member. And I like that quote, and obviously you explain it in the book, but for the purposes of the podcast, if you could explain why that's important.
Sure. In some cases, either because the family member's OCD is causing so much anxiety, you just want that person to get better quickly so that you're under less stress, that's a sort of natural impulse. or you feel wholly responsible for that person's OCD and you want that person to get better so that you don't have to feel guilty about it anymore, or so you can feel like you made up for it. There's a tendency sometimes to try to become that person's therapist and do all of the reading and do all of the therapy for them and chase them around the house with, one of my books saying, it says here you're supposed to do this. And this can be really destructive for a lot of relationships. Sure, you have to talk openly and honestly about mental health in the family, and especially if somebody's actively working on it, they might be doing their exposure therapy at home, and you may or may not be a participant in some of that work. But if you try to become the therapist, and that means that you're taking that away from, being the mom or being the wife or being the husband or the sibling or whatever it is. And ideally, if this person's going to get better, this person with OCD, you're going to be returning them to the family. It's like the OCD kidnapped them and is holding them hostage. And now, they're liberated through treatment. They're going to be returning to the family. So the family has to actually be there, has to be intact. There has to be a family to return to. And if what they're returning to is some kind of authoritarian, judgmental, I caught you washing your hands or kind of person, then it's just not going to last.
Yeah, that's a really good answer about them coming back to the family because they've been pulled away, as you say, with OCD, and that's something I've been very guilty of recently with a family member of my own. Because I didn't want to see them suffering anymore, I started to play the role of the therapist and getting anxious myself, urging them to do whatever, going through book after book, clearly sharing an article. And obviously what I realized only sort of a week or so ago is I was actually making it worse because, I was no longer that safe, comfortable family member. I was the annoying one as much as the disease or whatever it is.
And you were also causing yourself some harm, right?
Absolutely.
Because you're taking responsibility for something that really isn't under your control. Yeah. Let's say you're the brother or the son, or maybe you're just the friend. That part you have some control over. Yeah. What kind of a friend are you going to be? Now, you could be a friend who's kind of tough and says, "Hey, man, you got to get help," right? That's fine. But if you assume the role of the therapist, well, you're really, not only damaging that relationship, but you're also putting this extra stress on you that could cause your own mental health problems. And I see this in families all the time, parents who are struggling with mood stability and depression and constant anxiety over trying to fix their kid and not being able to give themselves that space to just be the mom, just watch a show and not focus on that one aspect of their child.
Yeah, really, really good. I'll do my best. That's all I can do. Okay, so for any family members listening, what are the 3 things that they could or should know about their loved one with OCD, or just, I guess, about OCD that will help them understand their loved one better?
All right, 3 things, huh?
Vague question.
Well, I'd be more comfortable with 4, but we'll see what we can do. Now, let's see. Okay, so first thing that the family member has to understand is that this is not a particularly rare or, sort of bizarre, shameful thing. This is a commonly diagnosed and treatable disorder. And the treatable part is the part to remember. So, people hear oh no, he has OCD, and then suddenly it's everything has changed. And the only thing has changed is that some of this person's experience that's been causing them such heartache can now be addressed and be addressed directly. So it's a good thing to get a diagnosis, assuming that that's going along with getting the right treatment from an OCD specialist. So that's the first thing, is just to remember that this is a common and treatable diagnosis. Next thing probably would be what we've already discussed a little bit, that it's not your fault. You didn't cause this to happen. You didn't create this person's OCD. You may have gotten wrapped up in it, and some of your behavior may have facilitate it. It's worsening, but that's not your fault. I mean, now that you know it, it might be your responsibility to make some changes. But just like in OCD treatment itself, self-criticism doesn't actually produce results. It's also true for the family member that sort of backwards looking regret and guilt and self-criticism. If it worked, I would encourage it, but it doesn't work. So you have to come up with a different strategy for moving forward. And self-compassion is probably better in that regard, which is really the theme, a large part of the theme of the book that I just wrote with Shala nicely, that comes out in a few weeks. Third thing to remember about your family member's OCD is probably, I don't know, this might seem like an odd one, but it is probably remembering that you're never really going to get it. You're never really going to understand it. I wrote this whole book, that's when a family member has OCD, about trying to understand it. And it's really just about giving you sort of a framework for understanding enough of it that you can be more helpful and less harmful to the process of this person getting better. But even if you know everything about OCD, you can't know what it's like to be that person and grapple with their unwanted thoughts and have the challenge of accepting uncertainty about their fears coming true. And it's easy to get into this habit of being very sort of academic about it and being like, well, you don't need to know if your hands are clean or dirty, or you don't need to know for sure about your sexual orientation or something like that. There's more important things that you could be doing with your life. That's all well and good, but there's just no way for you as the family member to genuinely and completely understand what it's like to be in that person's head. And you have to respect that. You have to leave just enough space for admitting that you're always going to be a little bit in the dark. And that's okay. It's like, never really truly know another person completely all the way. And the reason why that's important is in order for that person with OCD to really make the progress that they need to make in treatment to really get mastery over their OCD, at some level they have to know that this is their own journey. This is a journey of self-discovery. It's not that they're alone. Obviously, there are millions of people with OCD. But this is really about mastering their own mind and not relying on other people to do that for them. Yeah. So just having respect for that difference between what you think they're going through and what they're actually going through might be an important thing to remember.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thank you. And good use to recall things. Sometimes I struggle if someone asks me for 3 things, it won't come. So now I'm going to ask you for 4 things. So you talk about the 4 I's, which is identify, invite, interrupt, integrate. I just wondered if you could take a moment to explain these and why they're important, or why you created it.
So in writing the book, I thought about 2 things. What would a family member want to know, obviously, but also how would an OCD sufferer feel about their family member reading this book? So I tried to keep both of those characters in mind as I was writing it, because I wanted family members to read the book and feel empowered, or at least feel less in the dark. But I also wanted OCD sufferers to take a look at the book and use it as a way to facilitate a better communication with their family members. So, I can't explain to you what I'm going through, but, this does a pretty halfway decent job of it. So here you go. And I've actually seen that, since the book came out, I've seen that in my practice a few times, which is really cool. I didn't know how to explain this to my parent, but I gave them your book, and then they started saying things that, were a little bit less stupid than I was used to hearing them say. And like, this is opening up a dialogue. I feel really good about it. So, so in considering these 2 readers, I just sort of asked myself, well, what can a family member do, right? If a family member is not a therapist and they can't, force someone to do exposure therapy, how can they kind of identify their role in the system and use that, to bring about some positive change? And then I thought, what what would be the sort of, what are the key steps? And so the first step, the first I is identify the OCD or the behavior or the compulsion as the problem and not the person as the problem.
Yeah.
Right. So make this distinction. It's the it's not you're making me late. It's checking the light switch is making us late. It's not you're ruining my life. It's these compulsions are a problem, and I see that they're a problem because if you lead with what's wrong with you, then you're leading from a place of judgment, and what the person with OCD is experiencing there, this criticism, it's going to increase their anxiety. It's going to make them either defiant and double down on their compulsions, or just more reliant on their compulsions for a sense of safety. The family has to be a safe space for them. So if they're being accused of being a stain on the family record, that's a problem. Yeah. So if you're just identifying the behavior, that's a way in to say, look, I recognize that there's something going on, right? I'm not closed. I'm not unaware to what's going on in this house, and it has to be addressed. But I'm going to address the actual behavior. I'm not addressing you as a human being. So that's the first I. The next would be like, if you can then establish a dialogue, like, hey, can we talk about this behavior because I'm concerned about it? That's where you can invite collaboration. Of course, not everybody wants help. Not everybody wants to admit they have a problem. Not everything that looks like OCD on the outside even is OCD. I mean, that's why sometimes you need to get a professional assessment in there to sort of figure out what's going on. But in a lot of cases, just hearing that, okay, so my family member is aware that this behavior is going on, and they're not angry at me. They just want to know how to help me. I don't know how to explain it, but at least I'm listening. At least now we're having a dialogue. So then can you invite collaboration? So the question the family member has is there anything I can do to help? And sometimes you'll get a flat out, no, leave me alone, you don't understand. But a lot of times, what you get is a softening of like, well, I don't know if there's something you can do to help. All I know is that this is how I feel when I haven't done this behavior, and I have to do this behavior so I feel a certain way so I can move on. Now the dialogue is generating, the communication's getting better. And can you invite collaboration? Well, what are some things that we could do to maybe reduce this problem? The problem isn't you, the problem is the OCD. All things going well, that either leads to treatment or it leads to some kind of, self-help work. And if the family member can be involved, that's great. So then it leads to the third step, which is interrupting the obsessive compulsive cycle. And that's, helping out with exposure therapy. So you can't just remove all the soap from the house and expect the person to just say, okay, great, well, I don't have this hand washing problem. But you can start negotiating terms, like how can we do this together? What are some exposures that we can do that I can help you with? And this only works if it's on top of a foundation of identifying the problem, not the person, and inviting collaboration. So it's really the person doing the work with the support. As the person with OCD is getting better, we're doing less compulsions, being more open to uncertainty, being more mindful of their thoughts and feelings. Then the last step is integrating healthy behavior. And this is really, there's sort of two parts to this. So one is modeling healthy behavior. So, you may not have OCD, but you may have a certain rigid way of doing things. And if you could model a less rigid way of doing things, if you can model psychological flexibility or just any kind of flexibility, person with OCD can see that and say like, oh, okay, well, they don't have to be consistent. Maybe I don't have to be consistent. Maybe sometimes I wash after I touch a doorknob and sometimes I don't, who knows? Yeah. But more than just the modeling of and the integrating of the healthy behavior, it's also, if this person gets better, depending on how bad their OCD has been, a lot of time is suddenly going to be freed up. And a lot of OCD talk is suddenly going to be absent. And then there's that relationship there that needs to be repaired and addressed and tended to. And, like we were saying before, don't be a therapist, be a mom. Don't be a therapist, be a brother or sister, whatever. If the OCD symptoms get reduced, then what will you be interacting on? Like, what subjects will you be discussing? Because I've seen so many, I call them OCD families, Whereas like one person with OCD, but really the whole family is afflicted by the disorder, and their whole world is about, doctor's appointments and medication refills and, driving person to this place and that place and checking on the homework, and everything is just so wrapped up in the OCD that when they get better, it's, they need to start watching Game of Thrones, or something. Like they need to sort of like get into a show again, or, go out and play baseball, or, start making the relationship about something more than just the OCD. And that's what I mean by integrating healthy behaviors.
Yeah, really good answers. And you do a good job throughout the book of under each, for example, one of the chapters is reassurance seeking, and you use those 4 I's to kind of break that down, or how to approach it, which I like. And Game of Thrones is brilliant. We got a theory, my wife and I, that the next season's the last season, that we think they're going to do all TV, and then the final episode they do as a feature-length movie.
That's an interesting idea.
I reckon that would be the biggest blockbuster of all time, because everyone's going to have to go and watch it, because they're not going to...
It's true.
That's what I would do, but yeah, I think they may get hated on if that's the case. Okay, so in your book you talk about accommodation of OCD. The question that sprung for me is, and you do address it, but when should they, the family members that is, and when should they not accommodate their loved one's OCD?
Well, it really comes down to what you know and when you know it. So accommodating is totally natural. I talk about it in the book. I mean, relationships always involve some kind of accommodation, and you do it because, so you're one person and the other person is another person, and in order for you to occupy the same space at the same time, you have to be willing to compromise or make space for certain behaviors and certain things, and you generally this is done lovingly. It's not looked up as like, my girlfriend's moving in with me, so now I've lost half the couch. Well, she, you guys were already sharing the couch, and now she just has the keys to your apartment. So it's an accommodation. A lot of it just sort of happens without you even noticing all that much. And with children, of course, you're accommodating their needs. You're feeding them, you're clothing them, you're entertaining them, and you're not thinking of it as a loss. It's just another level of the relationship. So when this person that you love, that you're used to doing things for and enjoying doing things for, says, hey, could you check that for me? Or, hey, let me ask you this. If, you would trust me alone in a room with a knife, right? You wouldn't think I would do something crazy, right? And then naturally, you'd be like, what's wrong with you? Of course, that's a silly question, And so you start answering these OCD questions without even knowing they're OCD questions. And so you start accommodating the rituals. And of course, bad things happen after that, right? Because the rituals get accommodated. First of all, they become entrenched, right? So they get that feedback of like, oh, thank goodness I got that relief. I didn't know if I was going to make it, and now I've gotten that reassurance, and now I know I'm going to make it. Yeah. Plus, it becomes clear that I actually need the reassurance. So not only did the reassurance itself reduce my anxiety, but now I've also learned that nothing will reduce my anxiety but the reassurance. And, just in case one reassurance is enough, maybe I should go for 2 next time. And maybe I need to see it in writing. And it just starts to escalate. And it becomes a bit of almost like an addiction. Yeah. So the question is when to accommodate. Well, if you're already accommodating and you're already completely wrapped up in it, you can't just pull the rug out from someone with OCD, because it causes too much pain and it'll create other problems, and they'll just immediately create other compulsions to get around the one that they're suddenly not getting. And so it's not like this kind of tough love attitude actually works in the treatment of OCD. Accommodations need to be scaled back gradually, almost like coming off of a medication. Yeah. And again, if you're doing this outside of a treatment center and it's just the family working on it together, then it's got to be done with heavy collaboration. Like, all right, so here's what we're going to do, right? You and I agree this is how it's going to work. I'm going to, answer, this number of questions every day. And we're going to reduced the amount of soap that I put in the bathroom from 3 bottles to 2, and this is what we're working on. So there really shouldn't be any surprises in that process. And so you guys should be you guys are working on it as a team.
Yeah.
I don't know if I mentioned in the book or not. I mean, there's probably some areas where the OCD is so severe that there becomes something like a threat to somebody's safety. If you don't do this compulsion for me, some terrible thing's going to happen. And I wouldn't recommend people on their own experiment too heavily with that kind of stuff. I mean, bringing another person, like a treatment professional, into the system to address issues where your failure to accommodate might result in some complete breakdown or someone harming themselves or something like that. That may be really important. But the short version is, if you haven't started accommodating, don't start. And if you have started, start negotiating backwards.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, I really like that. And a question that's always a grey area for me, and it'd be good if you clarify it for me, is with reassurance seeking, is it okay for the family member? Obviously, let's say the person with OCD goes to them and say, I'm worried that I'm a bad person. I did this horrible thing. Am I a terrible person? And obviously, answering them is answering their reassurance seeking. But is it okay to obviously not say anything or say, I can't answer that, and hug them? That's an okay form of reassurance that isn't playing into the OCDs? If that makes sense? Is that sort of reassurance response okay? If I'm answering that. So it's kind of...
I'm sure I understand your question. So it's saying...
Imagine it more from like the parent's point of view, because if your child's coming to you and they're asking you all these questions and they're very anxious, it's hard to... I know you said kind of the down steps kind of ease off, but sometimes it's hard to even do that. Is it okay for them to just say, that you're reassurance seeking, I can't answer you, but it's okay to hug them? That's not then... if that makes sense,
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Not
absolutely
reassuring them in a negative way.
I think people often confuse the absence of reassurance seeking with the absence of
love,
compassion, or comfort. You can soothe the person. You can even, I would argue, you could even do things to help the person relax. You just can't engage them in the content of their obsession.
Okay.
So the question is, am I a bad person because I had this thought? You can't answer that question. First of all, it's an unanswerable question. That's a whole other topic. But even if it were an answerable question, whenever I think about questions like, am I good? Or do you think I'm good? I always think of there's a bit in an episode of Family Guy where Peter's wife says, does this dress make me look fat to you? And Peter says, no, honey, not to me. To everyone else, but not to me. So, do you think I'm a good person? My answer can't be trusted. I love you. Of course I think you're a good person, but you're not going to buy it from me, So anyway, so you can't answer the question, but you see that the person's suffering. There's nothing in OCD treatment that says you have to just blow them off and say, deal with it. I'm not answering that question. Get away from me. A hug, I'm sorry you're suffering. I see this is hard for you, I know you really want me to answer the question. If I were you, I'd feel the same way. I wish I could answer the question. What can we do? Can we do an exposure, or do you need to just take your mind off it for a little bit? Should we go, do something else? These are all fine. I think people get really scared about, I'm not supposed to give reassurance, and their way of dealing with it is not to give anything, because of their fear of giving reassurance. It becomes their own obsession. Yeah. I think there's a lot of wiggle room there. What you don't want to get wrapped up in is the content of the person's thoughts.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Hugs go a long way. Yeah. I'm a big fan of hugs.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so my next question was, you've loosely talked about this, but how and when can you interrupt your loved one's compulsions? And I guess interrupt it in a invited way. Or have I just answered my own question? Is there any more? Is there any more depth to that?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a clear answer to this, but with adults anyway, if we're talking about like a man and his wife or something like that, I'm a big fan of having them just establish contracts.
Okay.
So we just talk it out. Say, look, if you see me washing my hands, you can tell me to stop, and here's how I want you to tell me.
Yeah.
Because if you tell me in this other way, it's probably just going to upset me, and then I'm going to have to start my ritual over. But if you tell me in this way that we've agreed upon, it's going to, red flag will go up, and like, oh, right, this is this thing we talked about. But sometimes I might really be in the zone, and I might really think that I'm accomplishing something with my compulsion, right? So I won't want to be interrupted. I might snap at you a little bit. And here's how I want you to push back, right? Because we don't want this to turn into a fight. But, people who are doing compulsions who get interrupted, whether they've agreed to it ahead of time or not, can suddenly become really irate, because it's almost like you're about to finish this jigsaw puzzle and someone just came over and said, dinner's ready, and knocked it off the table, So this flood of emotion can come up. So this has to be talked about beforehand. Like, how are we going to navigate that? How am I going to respond to you being angry at me? What can I say that's going to address that, you're speaking to me in a way that's unkind, but also get back to the main issue here, which is I know you're doing the best you can to work on reducing your compulsions, and you've asked for my help. And so how can I remind you that you asked for my help? Yeah. I haven't come up in my mind anyway with some, sort of brilliant little rubric for like, how do you interrupt someone's compulsion without their permission and have it go smoothly? My guess is that you can't. I think these things need to be based on a collaborative effort.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of having a contract and then having a backup within the contract of, okay, you're not almost obeying the contract. For example, snapping, well then almost a secondary clause in that contract comes into play about how I now deal with that behavior. And I like that because it leaves no room for error or interpretation. Yeah. Okay, cool.
I think probably with mental rituals is the one area where a family member can get away with a little bit more, because what the family member is really asking in terms of interrupting the ritual is not so much that they stop, let's say, washing their hands or checking a light or something like that, but that they just return their attention. So if you're sitting on a couch with somebody and you're watching Game of Thrones and you turn and your partner is kind of making this like weird like face and is like clearly doing some sort of mathematical problem in their head, and you know them well enough to know they're not trying to figure out, if that's really Jon Snow's aunt or what, like, you know that they're doing their ritual because you've been around it enough.
Yeah.
What you're asking is for them to just come back and watch the show with you. So, I mean, it's still probably better if you collaborate beforehand, but I think you could get away with something like a nudge to the shoulder, like a, hey, are you paying attention? Were you watching this? That's a dragon. Did you see that? And it's not even looked at as, hey, stop doing your compulsion, you mentally ill person. It's just, hey, I see you've wandered off. Why don't you come back and join me? Yeah. It's very much the same thing you do in your own head when you're meditating. Oh yeah, I started thinking, but now I'm going to go back to watching my breath. And it's an invitation. It's not an admonition.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, actually, how is your side note? How is your? Are you still meditating? And you were using Headspace, I believe, the app.
I think last time we spoke, I was using Headspace. I still use Headspace, but I've since also done a lot of the meditations on 10% Happier, which I really enjoy. They're just slightly different vibe. It's all pretty much the same stuff, but they have these great little interviews before each meditation, and you learn about as much from the interviews as you do from the actual experience of meditating, because this stuff kind of sticks in your head. So, it's like physical exercise. I have long stretches where I'm on top of it, and it's, I'm doing it 6-7 days a week. And then I'll have like a series of events sort of get in my way where I find myself rationalizing and deprioritizing the role of meditation in my life. And then it comes back, Shala keeps me honest. We Okay, we sometimes text each other when, had the minutes and we've meditated. So, I'm kind of, being lazily minding my own business, and I get a text that says 12, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I better find the time to meditate today.
Yeah, no, I like that. It's good to have an accountability partner.
Yeah.
And if you both use Headspace, you can track each other on that as well. So
Yeah. It's, and it's not for me like that. When it doesn't happen, it's not like it doesn't happen because I don't want to. It's more, my brain just finds a way to treat it like it's not as important as some other thing.
Yeah.
Which is very unlikely. I mean, the other thing is probably scrolling through my news feed on Twitter or something, It's just the way the mind is.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Mine does the same. Okay, so I got a question here, and you talk about it towards the end of the book about sort of externalizing OCD or giving OCD a character. And sometimes therapists will do this with their client, and the client has to name the OCD, whatever, Dave, or whatever name they want to give it. Is that useful within the family for the mum or the brother to say, is Dave bothering you again, or whatever name that the person picked for it? Is that helpful to kind of almost make fun of it, the OCD, not the person, and externalize it from the family? Is that helpful in any way?
I think it's very helpful with children. I think that for children, it's very difficult for them to reconcile that they are the ones having these horrible thoughts. Yeah. And that's okay, because people have horrible thoughts and it doesn't make them bad people. Yeah. It's easier for them to think of a monster of some kind that's giving them the unwanted thoughts, and they're interacting with that monster and they're responding to that monster that is not them. Yeah. So I think that's very useful for children, and I think it's useful for parents to sort of, be in on the joke and be able to say, like, when the kid asks a reassurance seeking question, for example, say, Dave, I'm not talking to you, please bring, Jimmy back, or whatever it is. Or the kid comes home from a day at school and he's feeling really bad because he's been doing compulsions, and, sorry, Dave's been giving you such a hard time. Sorry for all your listeners named Dave. That's you probably go with something something different. But I find that sort of externalizing, even calling it the OCD, has mixed results with adults. That there's some externalization is good. My OCD keeps telling me this and that, and my OCD is really being a pain today. That's perfectly fine, but you're addressing the disorder. You're not really addressing it as a thing that is not you. Yeah. I'm a big proponent of learning to master OCD through obtaining a much wider perspective on your own mind. Having a mind that is allowed to have these thoughts, and therefore the thoughts are no longer the threat to you that you thought they were. You just, you're having a big thought in a small space, and so you've learned to make the space bigger, so now it's a small thought in a big space. But it's just thoughts. It's like it's not something you need to worry about, so you don't need to attribute it to some sort of outside force. Your tendency to respond to the thought a certain way, you could say, okay, that's definitely my OCD that makes me, kind of motivates me to respond in this certain way. But the author of the thought is not some external force. It's also not you, by the way. It's just thoughts arise and thoughts fall. That's what thoughts do.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, good answer. And you talk about psychoeducation in the book, and that's quite often what a therapist would do. First of all, is educate the client on what OCD is, its workings, and also the family. So with that kind of aim, what would be 3 books you would recommend for just OCD books? So whether it's the family or the actual sufferer, what would be 3 books you'd recommend for them to read?
Let's see. Well, I always recommend John Grayson's Freedom from OCD.
Yeah, good book.
That's just, I think, one of the best books out there and its focus on the role of uncertainty tolerance, I think, is really important. I often recommend Lee Baer's Imp of the Mind for getting a better understanding of kind of unwanted thoughts. bad thoughts. Not gonna lie, I often recommend the mindfulness workbook for OCD that I co-wrote, and for OCD sufferers who are sort of interested in hearing, in reading a memoir, reading kind of an experience of another person's OCD, I really like Jeff Bell's Rewind, Replay, Repeat. Is another book I often recommend. I'm uncomfortable with the questions like this because I know there's like 5 amazing books and I just failed to mention them, and I probably know the authors, and they're gonna be like, "Oh, you said my book." So the IOCDF does a really good job of maintaining a pretty current list of books. The International OCD Foundation. So that would be another place I'll just say, hey, kind of pick at random any of these books, and you'll probably do okay.
Yeah, I agree. All the books you mentioned were great, but near enough every book I've read on OCD has been good in its own way. And sometimes you have to read many of them because they all come from different angles and different points of views.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes just finding a book that resonates with you. Okay, so...
Yeah, and I think that's, by the way, an important point, because sometimes clients will tell me, like, oh, well, John Grayson says you should do this, but Lee Baer says you should do that. They have sort of different ways of approaching, let's say, writing exposure scripts, and then they come to me, and then you said here in this book that it should be this way, and which is it? Which is the exact perfect right way that's going to guarantee that I cure my OCD? And they're different, they're written from different perspectives because they all kind of work, but we're dealing with human beings here. We're not dealing with robots where it's like you put in the program and it responds the same way. So sometimes the best thing to do is to read several different books and explore which elements of them really connect with your personality and your way of processing information.
Yeah, I thought about that actually with my podcast, because I'm getting people like yourself on who are very knowledgeable in OCD recovery. They're sharing all this great information that in theory is applicable to every person with OCD, but there's some people out there, no doubt, who just don't like my interview style or me or my personality or my voice, or they hate the British or whatever. But the fact is, there are people that my style will resonate with, and those people will get it out because they're open. And so not everyone is going to resonate with everyone. And I think that's why it's important to have many books and other media channels.
It's especially true of mindfulness books.
Yes.
I've read several books on mindfulness, and I could, confidently claim to have understood about 5% of each of them. But, if you read 20 of them, you might have a good understanding of mindfulness.
I agree, especially if you do like the Zen Buddhism style mindfulness type books. On a whole page, I might get a sentence, understand it, but sometimes that sentence is so enlightening that it doesn't matter if I don't understand 90% of it. Yeah. Okay, cool. So when you were talking about mindfulness, I've got a quote here. You said, "Pain is a product of resistance." And I completely agree with this, and I love it. And there's another saying by Thich Nhat Hanh, and he says, when you learn to suffer, you suffer much less. So that's what he means there, obviously, is giving up resistance. So are there any sort of mindfulness exercises people can do as a family? Because sometimes the OCD sufferer might not want to, do the exercise, but I guess if you can do it as a family or something that can be done weekly or daily, is there anything like that? Like simple?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, that's the kind of sort of cool thing about mindfulness exercises is you can do them under pretty much any conditions.
Yeah.
I think people have it in mind that you have to meditate or you can't understand mindfulness, which isn't necessarily true, and you have to meditate in this very specific way or it's not going to work, whatever that means, and that's of course not really true. And it's got to be in this soundproof sensory deprivation chamber and with no distractions, things like that. I think absolutely if you have a family member who's willing to explore it with you, then any of these exercises can be done in the presence of another person, and that might be a good way to sort of get it done. I mean, family meditation time. I've tried this a few times with my kids. I haven't quite gotten it to stick, but they have all these brief meditations for kids, they're about 2 minutes long, where you sort of just feel your toes in your shoes and things like that. And they think it's pretty neat, but not neat enough to say, oh, hey, can we do it again? So I have to find a way to kind of make it more of a regular family activity. But yeah, I think that certainly it's something that it's also, again, it taps into that integrating healthy behaviors. So maybe the person in your family who has OCD would benefit from having a less judgmental and more observational perspective, of viewing their thoughts and feelings that would help them with their OCD. But maybe they're not ready, or they don't want to, or they don't believe that that's true. Yeah. Okay, well, then you go ahead and meditate. It's going to maybe improve your life. Maybe if you are going to establish a healthier relationship with your thoughts and feelings, you're going to be less reactive to your family member with OCD. You're going to come up with more useful ways of responding that will help them. And if nothing else, then the kind of toll that your family member's OCD is taking on you and your stress levels might be better managed. So you can get back to being the parent, sibling, etc. that you want to be, without being derailed by that person's OCD every time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's also like going back to me when I was saying about how I was sending links saying, oh, all you need to do is this, try this. It's like with children, they won't do what you say quite often, but they never fail to copy what you do. So if you lead by example, healthy behaviors, including things like exercise, nutrition, all of this, your family member is more likely to copy you than do what you say. So sometimes I look at it like that.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. Okay, so family members themselves have to tolerate uncertainty. The uncertainty around, will my loved one get better? How long will it take? Will they ever get better? And that could be quite anxiety-provoking for them. Is there any tips and advice? I was going to say, we talked about dealing with uncertainty a lot, but obviously I guess a lot of people maybe listen to this particular episode have never listened to any of my others. What advice do you have for them about dealing with uncertainty, just generally?
Well, so it's a great source of anxiety. Is my family member going to get better? When are they going to get better? What if they don't get better? And you have to be able to sit with not knowing, right? Because if you're not able to, then you're going to fall apart and you're not going to be able to help. And I think what people forget in this process often is that when we're asking family members to help in treatment, we're asking them to do things like not give reassurance or, not participate in rituals. We're asking them to do exposure, right? We're asking them to put themselves in situations where they're going to be acutely aware of the pain of a loved one, and they're going to not have any information about how long that pain is going to last or how bad it's going to be or how much of it is like kind of, they're doing, because they're the ones, all they have to do is give them the reassurance and that pain's going to go away. And we're saying, and just sit with that. And I think we sometimes forget that even if you don't have OCD, that's really hard to do. Yeah. And so you need to think about well, how am I going to sit with that uncertainty? How am I, and I think viewing that as an exposure is something that you too have to habituate to at some level. You have to learn to be less afraid of, and to say, okay, well, this is what it feels like to have an urge to help my partner out with or my family member out with their compulsion, and to not engage that urge, but to just watch it and let it take as long as it needs to take to fizzle out. One of the challenges about uncertainty acceptance, I think, is that there are a lot of myths about it. This is something I talk about I'm working on another book right now, and this is something that I kind of put in there, so you'll see this pop up later. But these myths about uncertainty, one of the reasons, there are reasons why we think uncertainty is so hard to sit with, is because we have very negative associations with it. So when you say someone I don't know if this plane's going to crash. There's uncertainty. Immediately what comes to mind is this idea that there's a 50-50 shot that we're all going to die, in this terrible plane crash. But accepting uncertainty doesn't mean 50-50, right? If you say, I don't know when or if my family member is going to get better, that doesn't mean all of a sudden, since you've acknowledged that you don't have certainty, that there's only a 1 out of 2 chance that they're going to get better, or there's a 1 out of 2 chance that they'll stay, really impaired. It just means there's a 1 out of something chance, could be 1 out of a million, that they won't get better. And you're just not doing the calculations. By accepting uncertainty, you're just saying it's 1 out of something. I don't know what. You want it to be 0 out of something. You want it to be 0 out of something chance that they won't get better, but you can't have it. So you have to admit there's a 1 out of something, but that doesn't mean it's 1 out of 2. Some of the other myths are things like there's some things you shouldn't accept uncertainty about, but of course you don't have a choice. This idea that we're terrible at accepting uncertainty, as John Grayson often points out, we accept uncertainty about all kinds of ridiculous things, like they'll say where's your car or your child in any given moment, and you can't really know for sure unless you're right in front of it. And sort of my favorite myth about accepting uncertainty is this idea that you have to assume the worst, that it's somehow you're not allowed to assume the best because, that's reassurance and that's compulsive. And then, you go to OCD jail if you break the rule. I think assuming the best is much more dangerous, risky exposure behavior. If I'm afraid of something and I choose behaviorally to interact with that thing as if nothing bad's going to happen, then that's a tremendous exposure. And so I can accept uncertainty, like, okay, yeah, maybe this is going to go really badly for me, but I'm just going to behave like it's not going to go really badly for me, and we'll see how it goes. Not only is that more effective, it makes a lot more sense than walking around telling yourself, probably a closeted gay pedophile serial killer, name your obsession, because I have to accept uncertainty, so I'm probably this terrible thing. That is a form of exposure therapy, but I think too often we default to that very negative, assuming the worst as a way of accepting uncertainty. Yeah. I think you're entitled to assume the best. That doesn't mean you should go on reassuring yourself everything's going to be fine. It just means reflect it in your behavior. How does a person behave when they're assuming that their car is not going to crash? Well, they're probably just driving and listening to the radio and enjoying themselves.
Yeah. I'm trying to imagine it in my own life. Yeah, I completely agree. We have a really unhealthy relationship with uncertainty. And as you say, when we drive, I'm oblivious. Actually, I'm not oblivious to the dangers of the road, because I think I can be quite an overly cautious driver, which I think is a good thing. But I'm always like, if I'm stuck on a motorway and I'm driving past another car on my left or right, if it's a free lane, I've got my hands on the let's say, because I can get lazy and I'll drop one hand off the steering wheel and I'm driving with one hand, and then my brain would go, you're overtaking, if you get a puncture you could slam into the car, so I grab the other thing, which I think is actually it's probably a good use of my brain being anxious, because that probably is a bad way to drive. But so many other activities in life, there's so much uncertainty, but I don't think about it because I've fully accepted that the best is most likely to happen, the worst may happen, but I don't want to worry about it. And I think it's trying to get to that place in other areas.
I think what you're saying with the driving thing is that you trust that there's a mechanism in place for correcting when maybe you've gotten a little lackadaisical. So it's not necessarily driven from this very dark place of, if you don't put your other hand on the wheel, you're going to die in a terrible accident. No. It's more you just become aware that you've gotten a little lazy, and then your brain just kind of motivates you to maybe, pay a little more attention to the road. And, that's, like you said, that's everything operating the way that it should be operating. And there may or may not be some anxiety involved, but it's not really an anxiety-driven exercise. You're aware that your brain has a mechanism in place for correcting when you might be, drifting into the other lane or something like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I can't remember which podcast I was on. It was either Reed Wilson or Jonathan Grayson, and they said they were talking about this point and saying about, a plane engine could fly off through your roof and kill you right now, but you're not worrying about that, and you're not anxious about that. but it's possible it could act.
Right.
And I actually live near an airport, so it's one of the busiest in the world. So it's highly likely out of any other area of the world that could happen to me. But yeah, I don't think about it. I actually do think about it now since they've said it, but I never used to think about it.
But you're doing a great job of accepting uncertainty right now. I often talk to my clients about the ceiling falling on their head. And I say, look, I mean, if a sentence starts with the word maybe, then it's objectively true. Okay? I mean, it's true. I can't think of a sentence, maybe I will eventually, but I can't think of a sentence that starts with maybe that isn't objectively true. It just doesn't mean it's worth our attention. So if I say maybe the ceiling's going to fall on my head, that's an objectively true statement. And you would think it was, pretty out there for me to immediately, like, now that I'm thinking about this, cancel the rest of the interview, kind of call up the building management, ask to talk to the architect, get up on my chair and start pushing on the ceiling, make sure it's safe, right? Yeah. I'm going to assume that it's safe. And I could choose to just never be under this ceiling as a strategy for that, but I'm not willing to. I'm choosing to be here in this moment. And that means I'm willing to accept the uncertainty that maybe the ceiling will fall on my head. Just because something is possible doesn't mean it's worth your attention. Yeah. And so, you are worth my attention in this moment, even though I might be risking my life.
Yeah.
So you're welcome. So I'm saying.
Yeah. No, thank you. I appreciate it. Something I do as well now, which obviously if I was extremely anxious, I don't think this would work. But with the kind of flippant thoughts that come in, I will say to myself, kind of quoting The Last Samurai, where I just say, well, today is as good as any day to die, which is what he says in The Last Samurai. And I love that. And that will sometimes just shut my mind up and stop me thinking about it. But it also triggers me to think, okay, well, if I were to die today, then let me not have any regrets on this day. Let me live it the best I can. It draws me back to kind of my values and just making the most. That if I were to die in an hour, at least I can say, do you know what? Today was good. I lived according to my values. I pursued my good dreams, and it's not a bad day to bow out. And that almost that stoic type philosophy helps me kind of through it.
That's good. That works well for the fears of some sort of immediate harm. As you know, with OCD, there's also the fear of this kind of like long, drawn-out harm that never ends, that perpetuates your life and your legacy and, all of that. But along those lines, I've found that most of the really good decisions I've made in life came about because of the willingness to say, well, it's just the rest of my life. It's not that big a deal.
That's true. In the grand scheme of infinity.
So what? So it's forever. Okay, so we've established it's forever. But do I want to do this? Is it in line with my values? Like you were saying, does it matter to me? Yeah. Am I willing to take the risk of, being perpetually unhappy? What's the alternative? Being probably perpetually unhappy and not doing that thing, right?
True. So. Yeah, absolutely. It's you're gambling on a possibility of a better future for a guaranteed unhappy future if you stay kind of where you are, if that makes sense, not taking the risk. And so the thing you fear is going to happen if you don't take a leap of faith, so to speak.
Your first gamble's getting out of bed, so you're already on a roll.
True. Okay, so I've got 2 listener questions now. One is, and this was actually from an OCD sufferer, but I've worded it in a way that if it was from a family member, because obviously this is what this podcast is about, but hopefully that the listener will still get their answer. So basically, how can a family member not get frustrated with the family member with OCD? Obviously, it can be, we've talked about this a bit, but it can be it can get you agitated and get you frustrated when your family member is suffering and they're delaying you or whatever it is they're doing. I guess how can the family member not get upset?
I mean, I don't think that's really on the table. I mean, of course they're going to get upset and be frustrated. I think we have this belief, and maybe it's more pronounced in people with OCD than without, that being in the presence of a negative emotional state is inherently problematic, and there's something we should know to do about it. Like, what do I do if I get angry? Just be angry, right? The question isn't, what do I do about this feeling? It's, how can I respond to that feeling in a way that's productive and useful? So I think what the person who's asking the question is getting at is probably better stated as, when my family member gets frustrated with me, how can they cope with that frustration in such a manner that doesn't lead them to then be mean to me or yell at me or something like that? Because if I'm on my way, if I have to get to work on time and I've been meant to, give you a ride to school or something like that, and now you're making me late for work because you're perseverating at the door over whether or not you touch something, there's nothing I could do to not be frustrated. Okay, I mean, maybe if I am some sort of black belt meditator, I can just see my anger as, as an illusion, because there is no self, and I can get into that headspace where like nothing really impacts me. But that's pretty unusual. Let's assume we're talking about a person who's not, at that level of enlightenment. So they're just going to be frustrated. And the question is, what can you acknowledge that frustration and honor that frustration and say to yourself, this is frustrating. This is what it feels like to be frustrated. I'm observing this frustration. Now, I want to help this person stop doing their compulsion, and I also want to get to work on time. So let me just sort of be aware of the frustration. It's right there. I'm going to prop it up right there on the shelf. And while that's kind of doing its thing, I'm going to see if there's like something I can say that's going to help snap this person out of their compulsive zone and bring them back to me so we can move on. Because a lot of times there are missed opportunities. And when family members interact with the one with OCD, the tone of resentment and hostility that's just sort of bouncing off of that internal frustration is creating a much bigger problem than you started with, especially in the case of reassurance. If I say, can you reassure me that this or that isn't true? And you're like, no, get away from me, it doesn't work, because I won't believe that you really heard me. I'll just think you're dismissing me out of hand. So my drive to get reassurance from you has just gone up tenfold because of your tone of voice. Whereas if you were more aware of your frustration and more willing to accept that this just is frustrating, you can say, okay, no, I can't answer that question right now. Sorry that you're going through a hard time. Yeah. Okay, well, now I've been kind of schooled away from doing my compulsion. I'm not saying it works every time, but anyway, I don't know if I've answered the listener's question or not. But the way, I don't think there is a thing you could do to not be frustrated. Of course, you can remember that this is a process. It's not their fault. They're not doing compulsions intentionally to harm you or make you miserable. You can remember all those things. But I don't think that's going to keep you from feeling feelings. I think you need to just learn how to feel those feelings and not translate them into unhelpful behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And also maybe in that moment, if you're angry or frustrated, just to breathe, make sure you're not
That's also good advice.
And just head off to another room for 5 minutes to cool down and then come back. And
also good ideas.
Yeah. I'm learning from my own experience at the minute. Okay, so the last listener question was, are there any obvious signs in a child, so I'm guessing it's a young child, that are very obviously point to OCD? And if so, what can the parents do about it? I guess
this is not a novel
Sorry, no, go on.
This is not a novel idea. I mean, it's difficult to diagnose OCD in a very young child because children learn about the world through ritual. They return to things that are familiar to them, which is why they like to watch the same shows over and over and listen to the same music over and over, or play with that one toy, because they just know that, well, when I'm with this toy, I'm feeling this feeling, and I don't get that feeling out of that toy, even though that might be a more interesting toy, so they just keep going back to the same thing. They engage in a lot of different coping mechanisms that on the surface look very compulsive, and they tend to be very superstitious, because they still believe in magic. which is nice. And so they don't want to step on that crack because, the polarity of the earth depends on it. And you have to let them explore that space. Where it gets into the clinical realm is if you see them not having any flexibility, not being able to sort of turn away from something when it's needed. And when you see them obviously, unhappy with what they're doing. Even in a young child, you can sort of tell when they're doing something that looks compulsive, but they like it, versus when they're doing something that looks compulsive and they don't like it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't have a great answer for that question, but I think that it comes down to, as a parent, being able to assess what the child's level of discontent might be with the behavior. If they're perfectly happy, doing things that are maybe repetitive or peculiar, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they have a mental health issue. And it is something I think you have to be a little bit careful of. Like I said, this is a familial disorder. It's not unusual at all for multiple members of a family to have OCD. So if you have OCD and you have a child, and, it's not impossible. It's not even unlikely that person might have a different relationship to anxiety than the average person. Doesn't mean they're definitely going to have OCD. And it doesn't mean that everything that they do that involves an unwanted thought or a ritual is a sign of a mental health issue. So you want to approach that with some amount of caution.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's good. I think there's some good signs, and obviously they can take their kid to a clinician as well, and the clinician should soon enough be able to get to the bottom of it if there's anything to worry about. Is there? So last question then. Is there anything else I've missed off that you feel the family members should know about OCD or helping their loved one, etc.?
The only thing that comes to mind is when I think about people who have been silent about their OCD, and now they're adults and they've never really been honest with their family members about the OCD because they never felt that they could. I don't think it's ever too late. You don't have to. It's up to you. You don't have to open up every part of yourself to every person. But there is something, sort of profoundly loving about opening yourself up to someone that you know as well as a family member, if you have a good relationship. And I think it's easy to get caught up in all these fears about, well, what if they don't get it, or what if they shame me, or what if they pity me? Oh my God, that's the worst thing. If they were to feel sorry for me, I don't think I can handle that. I hear that a lot, and I think it can be overcome. I think it can actually make your relationships much stronger. It's not for everybody, obviously, but I wouldn't want anybody thinking that, well, I missed my opportunity to be open with my parents about my OCD, or to be open with my partner about OCD. I'm actually just having this thought for the first time right now on the OCD Stories podcast, but I suppose there's going to come a time where I'm going to tell my children about my OCD.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say I'm looking forward to it, but I'm not hoping it doesn't come up,
Yeah. I think it helps that you're a therapist and you treat OCD, so by the time you probably talk about it, they'll be fully aware of what it is, to some degree, and it will just seem normal, like it was for you with your dad. So I think it should be a semi-decent conversation.
I think it'll go pretty well, and if either one of them ever struggle with it, I hope that they can come to me. You think like I think. It's going to be okay.
Will you give them a discounted rate on therapy?
Never. Charge them extra.
Yeah, that's very timely. Kind of felt like you were talking to me then, because I didn't seek treatment, and I'm happy to talk about this on the show. I didn't seek treatment until I was 16 or 17, and that didn't go well because I went to the NHS, and this was pre-2005, before they, in a huge quantity, trained CBT therapists. So basically you saw a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist. There weren't therapists in mass scale as they are now. It's quite easy to some degree to get treatment now, but you need like 3-month wait, but that's it. People are going to email me now saying they're on a 12-month wait, but
yeah.
Obviously you can go private as well in the UK, but so that didn't work out. They wanted me to do self-help books and stuff before they diagnosed me and stuff, and I was like, obviously I didn't do any of it. I continued to struggle, and I didn't explain my mental compulsions because I wasn't aware. I was only going through physical compulsions and stuff like that, which weren't taking up huge amounts of time. And anyway, so I then went to I said enough is enough at the age of, I think I was 26 or 27, and I just went privately to get help. And anyway, so basically I've never really had the conversation with my parents. I told them when I was like, after I'd been to see the psychiatrist at the age of 16, 17, and they kind of, in my personal opinion, they didn't deal with it that well. They kind of brushed it aside, like, yeah, mental illness is this far off thing, kind of like with cancer. Like, no one gets cancer, and then when it hits your family, you're like, shit, I never expected it would hit me or my family or whatever. Mm-hmm. And mental illness is like that, so they kind of brushed it off, and I did it within an argument, so it wasn't the ideal time to release it. And but now it's kind of like, and they loosely know, because I've talked about this podcast and stuff. They don't listen to podcasts or go on YouTube, so there's no way they'd ever. But they loosely, and they occasionally say, "Oh, there was a documentary on Channel 5 about OCD recently. Did you watch it? Do you want me to record it for you?" So they start saying things like that. But it's like this elephant. I've never talked about it. And recently in therapy, I've been speaking to my therapist about it, and I'm at that point now. I'm like, I want that conversation, and I don't want to blame them that they didn't spot it in me as a kid, or they didn't take me seriously when I was 17. I don't care about blame. I just want to have that open conversation, so that I almost don't feel like I'm hiding a part of myself, because I know it will help our relationship grow. And I hope that helps anyone maybe on the fence too, that maybe you need to blame them, but I don't think it's hugely helpful. I think more it's just to be open to boost the relationship, and that's kind of where I'm at and why I want to do it. But it's a tough thing to do, to sit down and say, look, I need to discuss this.
I think that's a key point that you just made, though. The question is, does this add something to the relationship? Right? What do I get out of it? I mean, if it's just a confession because I feel guilty because I didn't tell them about, this one aspect of my experience, but it's not going to add anything to the relationship, then it's probably not worth it. Yeah. But if it is a way to express love for another person, because, that's mostly what expressing love is. It's sort of showing where you're vulnerable. Yeah. And you have a family member that you think is capable of receiving that love, then it probably is worth it. It'll probably make both your lives just a little bit better.
Yeah, true. I completely agree. Okay, so that's all the questions. I'm no doubt, the family members listening to this have got a lot that's going to help them support themselves, support their loved ones, and also anyone listening with OCD, no doubt I've got something from this episode as well. So thank you once again for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, absolutely.